Hi, it's Sandra here from Create in Spain, and today I'm going to show you these very pretty flowers. At least I think they're very pretty. A few different designs in here, but they're all basically made in a very similar way and in different colorways and just different shapes, sizes, forms. And I've got another one which is slightly different again, this one here. And I just want to show you how to make these. I'm going to give you the SVG file for the shape of the petals, and they're very easy to make. That can be made in a couple of different ways. Now, when you have the file, you'll see that you get several different sizes, and I have the starting of a flower here, several different sizes of the same petal shape. And you can choose how many petals you use to make a flower. In general, I found that something like sort of 5 or 6 is about the right number. And you simply cut out multiple copies depending on how many flowers you want. Now, this is actually cut from an embroidery backing. This is what the flowers are cut from. It's embroidery backing. It's not overly thick or heavy, but it's very strong stuff. You can't easily tear it, and it will stand up to a lot of abuse. So it's great for making flowers because, you know, if you're a bit clumsy, you're still not going to manage to wreck them. To be quite honest, it's going to be very difficult. It's also very good for a colouring purpose. Now, I use an airbrush to colour mine, but if you don't have an airbrush and you want to manually colour this stuff, it's fine. All you can do is put your paint on it and allow it to dry and then make your flowers up. If you're not going to use an airbrush, that's definitely the easier way of doing it. It's far more difficult to apply paint once your flowers are made. But this stuff won't disintegrate when it gets wet, which makes it very similar to paper but different. That's the main difference. You're not going to get this tearing to pieces because you've got it soggy. You'll just have to let it dry or dry it off with a heat tool or a hairdryer or something, and then you're ready to go. Okay. Now, this stuff can be bought in various places, but this is one of the lightweight ones. I get mine from a certain online store. I've got an enormous amount of this in my stash, and so I use it quite happily. But it's not overly expensive, you know, when you consider what papers cost. It isn't any worse, I don't think, than that. So that's the basic idea. So we have here some shapes that I've cut out, and I'll give you a tip for airbrushing. Now, at the moment, you may or may not be able to tell, I've got a fan on in my craft room because it's very hot. I'm filming this in August and it's about 36 degrees. It's a bit warm. But I've got my fan on, and so as you can see, or probably could see, that if I put this onto a surface to airbrush them, they're going to fly around all over the place. So I tend not to do that if I can possibly help it. Now, there's 2 ways that you can, well, 3 ways you can do this. You can either randomly airbrush your paper before you cut it. You can stick it down onto a surface with a bit of blue tack or something and then airbrush it. You can make the flower up in its entirety and airbrush it afterwards, or you can do what I did, which is to layer my designs up, starting with the smallest. And what you do when you layer these up, you know, they're very simple to put together. A child can do this. What you do is you offset them so that the petals don't all go in exactly the same direction. You don't want them lining up like that. You want the solid edge of one petal to go against the cut edge of the next petal, and so on and so forth. And so you can line all these up. Actually, that was a bit off center. I'll put the hole somewhere slightly different. And do that. And if you have a pin with a large head, you can now airbrush that as if it were actually constructed as the flower. The reason I like to do it this way is because if I have my flower centre and maybe I want a yellow centre and a dark blue flower or something, I can paint my flower centre and put it in afterwards, and it's not going to have the colours that I've chosen for the petals on it. Other than that, you can, if you're careful, put a little bit of cling film around the centres and then take it off when you've airbrushed your flower. But to be honest, it's easier to do it like this and to make it up afterwards. So to make it up is just as easy. Now you will need, if you're going to use these centres, and these are made from this stuff, which is an air dry foam modelling material. And I did a previous video, I think it's the last video I did on this stuff. And basically it's very lightweight. It's polystyrene beads, minute polystyrene beads, put together in a silicone base, and you just take it out of there and you shape it and you model it. Now I've got this on a wire simply because I find it easier to get things to dry when I stick them up into a piece of polystyrene. But you don't have to do that. You can put them on hair grips and all sorts of things. But this is nice and dry. Dry the stuff for 24 hours or overnight at least before you do anything else with it. This has been drying, well, this has been dried for a couple of days and it's really, really solid. But because it is made from a silicone base, you want a silicone glue to put your first petal on. So for my first petal, I have my silicone glue. Whoops! Told you it was breezy around here. Well, going everywhere. Okay, so you want to put your ring of glue, and I usually do a ring when I'm doing this, near to the edges of the opening parts of the petal. Okay, got some glue on there. So just put my centre in, and then I would stick that to the centre. Now from there on, if you want to use a different glue because you find the silicone glue a bit sort of gloopy and messy to use, you can do, because you've now got something to stick to paper and it really won't matter. But for the first instance, you need to use a silicone glue or something that you know will stick to that type of material. But silicone is obviously the easiest and it's one of the cheapest glues that you can get anyway. So that's that one. I'm going to swap over to another glue that I happen to like, which is my varnish, just checking that it was coming out, and it is. So the next one, you can just put a ring around like so. Put this in, and again, try and make sure that they're not lined up, that they're offset, and then you can do that. Okay, now you can squeeze it tight around the center of the flower if you so wish, that's fine. And the next ones, I'm going to do a smaller circle because I want to leave the outside petals floating freely. I don't want them adhered too much. So find my hole there and offset again. And while I've got that one in that hand, I'll just do this one. There we are. This varnish dries quite rapidly, so it should be fine for this. And just open that out so I can see where my petals need to line up. And there we go. That is pretty much all you need to do. Now if you want to, you can distress these petals beforehand by using modelling tools. in the same way as you would if you were making icing flowers and things like that. But if you don't have them or you don't want to use them, just really scrunch this stuff up. You're not going to break it, you're not going to tear it, you're not going to damage it. You'll just bring life to your flowers. And there we go, there we have a nice pretty flower. This one has a white centre. Just because if I want to colour it, I can take a paintbrush and I can just pull these petals down and paint it, it'll be fine. Paint it with acrylic if you are going to paint it. You can paint it before you put them in, like I've done with this one, or you can paint it afterwards if you haven't made up your mind what colour you want to do it. It's your choice. But I will give you a link to the file, and I will probably put a couple of different petal shapes in there. In fact, if you keep this held up tighter, it looks a bit like a tulip, so you get another variation as well.